So the good or the bad news was that that was the technical piece. This next piece isn't. So what I wanted to talk about, we just heard the conversations by Preston and Joe, and here we have a piece of spectrum, and it's a substantial piece of spectrum. 150 megahertz is a very substantial piece of spectrum. There's rules being generated to allow this to come into play and be used. There's rules that are allowing this to bring in new business models, maybe new entrants. We've what you use democratizing, federating. Shouldn't you have had republicizing or something like that? It's election year or something. All right, gotcha. Yeah, the Donald wouldn't have approved. But so lots of thoughts about the spectrum and the fact that it could be made real. Joe was mentioning lots of the technical problems about how you can deploy this. We spent a lot of time trying to figure them out, and we think everything is doable. So you've fundamentally got an issue where you've got the spectrum. Technically, it looks very doable, and I think the pieces that then we sit around and worry about, and that is to make this successful, you've somehow got to create an ecosystem. And the ecosystem at its base level starts obviously with the chipsets and whether anybody will create a chipset for a device that will go into a handset, and what is it that drives the handsets at the moment. At the moment, what drives the handsets is the fact that you've got 4 carriers who take spectrum, buy spectrum through auctions and so on, and look to bring in the devices to make use of that. You've got a core radio, you've got all the infrastructure piece, which we've talked about a little bit, and I think that that's something we feel pretty good that we can get a handle on. You've got the issue of deployment, and I put that up because Joe mentioned it. I think the ease of deployment has been and continues to be a bit of a thorn in the side of small cells, in the sense that it's not that easy to go and deploy thousands and thousands of them all over the country. You can go out and maybe wrestle a city to the ground and get 10, 20, 30 sites done, but it just fundamentally isn't very easy. So because this spectrum sort of lends itself to the idea that cells are going to need to be fairly close together or they're going to be indoor, you've got to look at that particular problem and figure out how can you make that go away? How can you try and solve that problem? And as I say, I think one of the things that we keep looking at is that very often we all get very tied up in the little piece that we may be doing. We don't necessarily try and think about, well, you can build all this stuff and lob it on the table and it'll be a great thing. But at the end of the day, if no one actually picks it up and uses it, it was a waste. So figuring out things like deployment are a big deal. Joe mentioned the fact that we decided that, in fact, one of the problems with deployment was you had to sort of stand the problem on its head in terms of small cells. You had to look at it as a business problem, a return on investment, rather than a technical issue about putting a small cell on a pole somewhere or putting a small cell in a business. And it was all about, in the traditional sense from us, it's all about what will that do to benefit a carrier in terms of what will it do in terms of spectral efficiency, what will it do in terms of capacity, how much is it going to cost, and how much is it going to cost to run once you've deployed it. So from our perspective, we looked at that piece and said, look, let's take that problem and sort of redefine it as being it's a return on investment problem. So when we look at this deployment issue, whether you go inside a building or whether you go into the street and put a small cell there, it's all about a return on investment and answering the question about why do it. In terms of the why, I think this piece, I should have mentioned the maintenance, but this piece here, the application, the reasons that it makes someone want to come and do it. And in this sense, we've talked about the idea that maybe it isn't just the traditional carriers that come along and deploying this. Maybe it's a whole host of people who haven't been thinking about this. And I think you've got to create an environment where there's enough in it for them to want to come. And that comes through things like applications, whether you can create applications that an enterprise now has a telephony system, maybe some enterprise applications that they can bring in these bring your own device environments inside the enterprise, and it works seamless. And when they move outside and maybe they roam or move into a carrier network, they get a very similar experience because they move from LTE to LTE. So I think from our perspective, applications itself can go a long way to help create and foster that need or that desire for someone to see this as a really good idea and go deploy. I think the final one we look at here is all about business model. And it comes down to, I guess where I was going in the first place, is that at the end of the day, somebody needs to figure out why an enterprise, why an alternative carrier should go do this. What is the return for them on the overall investment of putting this network out? And we talked during the discussion, Joe talked a lot about how this would interface with existing networks, how it would interact between an enterprise indoor and maybe an outdoor network. And I think there's a lot of business relationships that have to be worked to make this real. I think if all we did was we created little small islands out of 3.5 in certain buildings, that would be a mistake. I think we have to figure out the business about how do you create a business relationship such that you deploy this in an enterprise, and when somebody walks outside, it actually moves with them. And maybe it's an issue around an enterprise to a carrier agreement or an enterprise to another type of network agreement. But you've got to have a business model that allows portability, maneuverability, and mobility around. So from our perspective, I think the business model, and lots of these things drive into it clearly because lots of these things drive cost. I mean, Preston was talking about the fact that volume plays a big part in terms of motivation around a lot of these things, and it plays a big part in terms of cost. So there's a lot of problems to get our arms around here. And I think from our perspective, it's about looking at this with what you'd call the can-do approach to problem solving. There's lots of problems here that I think it's very easy to sit back and throw your arms up and say, well, it's just going to be really too difficult. I think when you look at the prize, which is 150 megahertz of spectrum, potentially getting to a local user with a great experience, I think it's really worth us spending some time trying to nail some of these things to make this happen. So in terms of that, here's a view that I'll give you, which is, at the moment, if you look at the current way that the ecosystem exists, the cycle is very much contained. As I mentioned before, the device relies on the chipset relies on demand is generated from the carriers are looking at it in terms of the spectrum, and so it's a very closed sort of system. And if you're sitting there and you're thinking about a device, what's going to make you want to do 3.5? Well, the carriers obviously are going to have to come in. You're going to have to see how are you ever going to know if an enterprise is really going to take this and run with it. And I think you look at it, and this is where I say that some of the problems seem a little intractable, but I think this is where lots of the thought needs to go to break this cycle and get things moving, because you need the chipset, and I believe the chipsets are moving. I think we're going to see them maybe end of next year, beginning of the year after. But you need the devices to be enabled first. Because for an enterprise to deploy, I mean, unless there's something there to hang off the end, what's the point? So breaking that cycle, I think, is a big deal. I think